Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. This happened last summer. The kind of summer that sticks to your skin and smells like cut grass and distant barbecue. I was house sitting for my Aunt Clara while she and her husband were on a cruise through the Greek islands. For a 19-year-old community college student with a dead-end summer job, this was the ultimate prize. 2 weeks alone in a beautiful, quiet house in the suburbs with a swimming pool, a fully stocked fridge, and no rent. The house was a mid-century modern place, all clean lines and big windows looking out onto a wooded lot. It felt like a sanctuary. The only weird thing, the only off note in this perfect symphony of solitude, was the landline phone. Aunt Clara had mentioned it offhandedly when she gave me the keys. "Oh, and don't mind the phone in the hall if it rings. Just let the machine get it. It's just a wrong number. It's been happening for years." I'd laughed. Who still has a landline? She'd smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. We keep it for emergencies and for, you'll see. It'll probably ring. Just ignore it. I'd forgotten about it almost immediately. For the first 3 days, it was paradise. I swam. I binged movies on their massive TV. I ordered pizza. The summer sun beat down outside, but inside, the air conditioning was a perfect, constant hum. I felt like I'd won the lottery. On the 4th day, it rang. It was a jarring, shrill sound, a double ring that belonged to another era. I jumped, spilling soda on my shirt. I'd never heard a phone with that particular cadence. It came from the hallway, an old beige rotary phone mounted on the wall, looking like a museum exhibit. I remembered Aunt Clara's words. Just let the machine get it. I waited. The phone rang again, and again, a 4th time. Why wasn't the answering machine picking up? The ringing was aggressive, demanding. It felt like it was shaking the whole wall. On the 7th ring, I couldn't take it anymore. I walked over and looked at the machine sitting on a small table beneath the phone. The red message light wasn't blinking. The power cord was dangling, unplugged from the wall. I sighed. Aunt Clara must have unplugged it before she left. The phone rang for the 9th time. What if it was her? What if something was wrong with the cruise? Heart pounding with a sudden irrational fear, I snatched the receiver from the hook. "Hello?" There was nothing but static on the other end. Not the white noise of a bad connection, but a low, guttural, grinding static. Underneath it, I could hear what sounded like breathing, wet, labored, like someone struggling through fluid-filled lungs. "Hello?" I said again, my voice tighter. The static crackled, and a voice broke through. It was a man's voice, but distorted, stretched thin, like a tape recording played at the wrong speed. "Is he there?" The words were dragged out, each one a separate effort. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to sound authoritative but hearing the tremor in my own voice. "You need to check," the voice whispered. and then it was swallowed by a surge of static that sounded like a scream heard from miles away. I slammed the phone down. My heart was hammering against my ribs. I stood there in the hallway, staring at the innocent beige device, half expecting it to ring again. It didn't. It was a prank call. It had to be. Some kids with a weird soundboard who'd been calling this number for years, just like Aunt Clara said. I plugged the answering machine back in, making sure it was set to pick up on 2 rings. There, I thought. Problem solved. The next day, I tried to put it out of my mind. I went for a run, the summer heat a physical wall. When I got back, dripping with sweat, the house was blissfully cool. I grabbed a bottle of water from the fridge and noticed the blinking light on the answering machine. One new message. A chill, completely separate from the air conditioning, prickled my skin. I hadn't heard the phone ring. I must have been in the shower. I pressed play. There was a moment of hiss, then the same grinding static from the day before. The wet, ragged breathing. And then the voice, clearer this time, but no less distorted. Why won't you check? He's in the wall. Click. The message ended. I deleted it immediately, my finger stabbing the button. My mouth was dry. He's in the wall. It was a classic horror trope. This had to be an elaborate, sick joke. But how were they doing it? How were they leaving messages on a machine that was supposed to intercept the call? That night I couldn't sleep. The house, once my sanctuary, felt different. The big windows that looked onto the woods now felt like eyes. Every creak of the settling timber was a footstep. Every groan of the pipes was that wet, labored breathing. I was lying in the guest bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it. A faint, scratching sound. It was coming from inside the wall behind my head. I sat bolt upright, my blood freezing in my veins. It was probably a squirrel, or a mouse. The house was old. It was surrounded by trees. It was an animal. It had to be. The scratching stopped, and then the phone rang. The sound was deafening in the silent house. I watched the door, waiting for the machine to pick up. It rang a second time. On the third ring, the machine clicked on. I heard my own voice from the outgoing message. You've reached the Henderson residence. We're not available right now. A blast of static drowned out the rest of the message. Then, the voice from the phone was suddenly coming from the machine speaker, filling the hallway, spilling into my room. It wasn't whispering now. It was screaming, a raw, desperate sound of pure terror. He's in the wall. He's in the wall with me. Get me out. Get me out. Get me. The message cut off with a final deafening clatter, like the phone had been dropped down a metal chute. Silence. I don't know how long I sat there, paralyzed. Minutes. Hours. The summer night was utterly still. No crickets, no wind. Just the hum of the AC, which now sounded like the steady breath of the house itself. I had to check. I had to prove to myself it was a joke, because the alternative was unthinkable. I got out of bed, my legs weak. I didn't turn on the lights. I walked into the hallway and stood before the answering machine. The message light was blinking. One new message. I couldn't bring myself to press play. Instead, I went to the phone itself. I looked at it. This relic. This thing that had become a portal to someplace awful. And I noticed something I hadn't before. There were 2 phone jacks in the wall. 2 lines. One was plugged into the answering machine. The other was a spare, empty. This phone. It could ring on 2 different lines. Aunt Clara didn't have 2 lines. She'd never mentioned a second number. The phone had 3 buttons on its base. Line 1, line 2, and hold. The line 2 button had a small, almost invisible light next to it, and it was lit up, a faint, steady red. This phone was actively receiving a dial tone on a second, secret line. My hands were shaking. I stared at that little red light, a beacon from a nightmare. The rational part of my brain had finally shut down, overruled by a primal, screaming fear. This was no prank. This was something else. I reached out a trembling finger and pressed the line 2 button. I held the receiver to my ear. The sound wasn't a dial tone. It was the static. The low, grinding, hungry static. And underneath it, the breathing. Closer now, as if the mouth was right up against the membrane that separated our worlds. And then, a new sound. A faint, metallic tapping. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from both the receiver in my hand and from somewhere inside the house. Tap, tap, tap. I followed the sound, the phone receiver still pressed to my ear. The static and the breathing my horrifying soundtrack. I walked through the dark living room, into the kitchen. The sound was louder here. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the basement door. My aunt had been very clear about the basement. The stairs are a bit rickety, sweetie, and it's just a bunch of old junk down there. No need to go poking around. The door was always locked. She'd given me a key for it, just in case, but I'd tossed it on the key hook and forgotten about it. I fumbled for it now. My fingers slick with sweat. The tapping from the other side of the door was more frantic now. Tap, tap, tap. Tap, tap, tap. I unlocked the door and pulled it open. A wave of cold, damp air washed over me, smelling of earth and decay. The stairs descended into absolute blackness. The voice in the phone changed. The static receded for a moment. The distorted voice was pleading, sobbing. You're here. You're finally here. Hurry. He's sleeping, but he won't sleep for long. Who are you? I whispered into the phone, my voice cracking. The first one, the voice gasped. The one before you. He brought me here. Through the phone. He likes the quiet houses. A terrible picture was forming in my mind. The wrong number that had been happening for years. The previous house sitter, a utility worker, someone who had answered the phone and, what, been pulled through? He lives in the wires, in the walls. The voice wept. He feeds on the sound of a voice on the line. He brought me here to keep me quiet, to listen to me scream. The tapping started again, frantic, from the depths of the basement. Tap, tap, tap. The wall at the back, the voice urged. Please. I found a light switch at the top of the stairs and flipped it. A single bare bulb flickered on below, illuminating a concrete floor and stacks of boxes. The tapping was coming from the far corner. I descended the stairs, each step groaning in protest. The basement was exactly as she'd said. Junk, Christmas decorations, old furniture covered in sheets, boxes of books. In the far corner, behind an old rolled-up carpet, was a section of the wall that looked different. The concrete was newer, smoother, a perfect rectangle about 6 feet tall and 3 feet wide. It looked like a patch job, and from behind it, the frantic tapping was now a pounding, a weak, desperate pounding of a fist on concrete. He sealed me In the voice in the phone sobbed. It was weaker now, the static rising to claim it again. When he was done listening, I dropped the phone. I didn't need it anymore. I could hear the pounding with my own ears and the faint, muffled cries that accompanied it. A human being, trapped, alive. I stumbled backward, away from that awful wall, my mind shattering. I tripped over a box and fell hard, my head hitting the concrete floor. Stars exploded in my vision. The last thing I saw, before darkness swallowed me, was the old rolled-up carpet I had dislodged. Something had fallen out of it. Something metallic and heavy that gleamed in the dim light. It was a sledgehammer. And the last thing I heard wasn't the pounding or the crying. It was the phone. Upstairs in the hallway, it began to ring. Not the shrill double ring of line 1. This was a different ring. A single, soft, patient tone. The ring of line 2. I woke up in the hospital with a concussion and 12 stitches in my scalp. Aunt Clara had cut her cruise short after a neighbor, concerned by the wide-open basement door and the lights on all night, had found me unconscious on the floor. I told them everything. The police, my aunt, the doctors. I told them about the phone, the messages, the voice, the pounding in the wall. They listened with polite, concerned faces. The police found nothing. The phone was a standard landline. The provider confirmed only one number was active at that address. The answering machine had no saved messages. The basement wall was examined, tapped, and declared to be solid concrete, poured decades ago. The sledgehammer was just an old tool. My aunt was worried, not about ghosts, but about my mental state. She thought the stress of being alone, combined with a blow to the head, had conjured a vivid, paranoid hallucination. The doctors agreed. They used words like isolated incident and sleep paralysis. I was released after 2 days. Aunt Clara never left me alone in the house again. We never spoke about it. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. A few weeks later, after my aunt had returned home and life had supposedly gone back to normal, I got a text from her. It was a picture of her living room, newly repainted. "Looks great, doesn't it?" she wrote. And in the corner of the photo, on the hall table, was the answering machine. Its message light was blinking. A solid, unwavering red dot. One new message. I don't regret the concussion or the hospital stay. I regret answering that phone. I regret pressing that line 2 button. I regret learning that some houses aren't quiet because they're empty. They're quiet because something in them is listening, and it prefers it that way. My regret is that I opened a door that should have remained closed. I gave it a voice to listen to. I gave it a scream to feed on. And now I have this terrifying certainty that it's still there, in the wires, in the walls, waiting for the next quiet house, the next lonely voice to answer its call. The third phone is always ringing. You just have to know which line to listen on. And once you do, you can never hang up. The summer I turned 17, my parents decided we needed to reconnect as a family. This meant trading Wi-Fi for mosquitoes and a 2-week vacation at a remote cabin on Blackwater Lake. The name should have been the first clue. The photos online showed a picturesque, if slightly dark, lake surrounded by dense pine forests. The cabin was called Whispering Pines, which sounded charmingly rustic. The reality was a damp, two-room shack that smelled of mildew and regret, perched on the edge of water so dark it looked like oil. The pine trees didn't whisper. They groaned under the weight of the summer heat, pressing in on the clearing like a suffocating blanket. My younger sister, Chloe, who was 14 and surgically attached to her phone, took one look and burst into tears. There was no service. None. We were utterly off the grid. My dad, ever the optimist, clapped his hands together. It's an adventure. We'll fish, we'll hike, we'll play board games. By the third day, the adventure had worn thin. The fish weren't biting. The board games had devolved into arguments, and the silence was starting to feel heavy, intentional. The only thing that held any interest was the lake itself. It was preternaturally still. No waves, not even a ripple, as if the water was too thick to move. It was a perfect black mirror, reflecting the oppressive gray sky and the gloomy pines with an eerie clarity. That's when Chloe started acting strangely. It started small. She'd always been a bit of a dreamer, prone to staring out windows. But this was different. She would stand at the water's edge for hours, not moving, just staring down into the blackness. When I called her name, she'd jump, startled, as if waking from a deep sleep. "What?" She'd snap, her eyes looking glassy and unfocused. "What are you doing?" "Nothing. Just looking." "At what?" "There's nothing to see." She'd just shrug and wander back to the cabin, leaving me with a cold feeling in the pit of my stomach. The first real incident happened that night. We were playing cards by the light of a gas lantern. Hiss, the only sound besides the occasional plop of something in the lake. Chloe was staring out the window at the dark water, her cards forgotten in her hand. "Chloe, it's your turn," my mom said gently. Chloe didn't respond. Her breathing had become slow and deep. "Chloe?" Her head turned slowly from the window, but her eyes, they were wrong. The usual bright blue was clouded over, a milky, distant gray, and she was smiling. It wasn't her smile. It was a placid, empty expression that didn't belong on her face. "The water is so quiet," she said. Her voice was flat, monotone. "She's so quiet. She wants to play." We all stared. My dad laughed nervously. "Okay, very funny, kiddo. You're creeping us out." The moment broke. Chloe blinked and her eyes cleared. She looked confused. "What? What did I say?" We passed it off as her being bored and trying to get a rise out of us. But I couldn't shake it. The look in her eyes had been utterly vacant. The next day, I found her down by the dock. She was kneeling at the very end, her face inches from the water's surface. She was having a conversation with her reflection. "I know," she was murmuring. "I don't like it either. It's so loud up here." "Chloe," I yelled, running down the dock. The boards bounced under my feet. She looked up, irritated. "What?" "You're scaring her." "Scaring who?" I asked, grabbing her arm and pulling her back from the edge. "My friend," she said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. She pointed at the water. In the perfect, glassy surface, her reflection stared back. But it wasn't mirroring her irritated expression. It was still smiling. That same, placid, empty smile. I stumbled back, dragging her with me. "That's not a friend," I stammered. "It's your reflection." She wrenched her arm free, her eyes flashing with the anger I'd never seen in her before. "You don't know anything. She's lonely. She's been alone for so long, and she says I'm the only one who can hear her." After that, things escalated quickly. Chloe stopped eating. She stopped talking to us, except in that flat, monotone voice to deliver cryptic messages. She says the forest is hungry. She says the sky is a lie. She spent every waking moment at the water's edge, whispering to her reflection. My parents were finally, truly scared. The adventure was over. This was a crisis. My dad decided we were packing up and leaving first thing in the morning. The atmosphere in the cabin that night was thick with fear. We locked the door, something we'd never bothered with before. Chloe was put to bed in the loft, and I slept on the couch downstairs, my dad in a chair by the door. I couldn't sleep. I lay there listening to the sound of the lake. It was no longer silent. I could hear it now, a faint, almost melodic humming, just on the edge of hearing. It was coming from the water. And then I heard the scratching. It was a soft, persistent sound at the cabin door. Not like an animal, like fingernails. Scritch, scritch, scritch. My dad heard it too. He sat up, his face pale in the moonlight. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice cracking. The scratching stopped. A moment later, it started on the window next to me. I turned my head slowly, my heart a frozen lump in my chest. Pressed against the glass was a face. It was Chloe's face, but it was wrong. Her skin was dripping wet, her hair stringy and plastered to her cheeks, and her eyes were solid, glossy black orbs. She was smiling the empty smile. She tapped on the glass with one pale finger. Tap, tap, tap. Then she was gone. A scream from the loft. My mom. I scrambled up the ladder. My mom was standing by Chloe's empty bed, her hands over her mouth. The window in the loft was wide open, the curtain fluttering in the still night air. Chloe was gone. We erupted from the cabin, my dad grabbing a flashlight. Its beam cut a frantic path through the darkness, towards the lake. She was there, standing on the dock, her back to us, facing the black, still water. She was wearing only her white nightgown, which was soaked through and clinging to her skin. She was perfectly still. "Chloe," my mom screamed, her voice raw. "Chloe, come back." Chloe didn't turn. She took a step forward, onto the very edge of the dock. "No," my dad roared, sprinting down the path. I was right behind him, my blood roaring in my ears. The humming from the lake was louder now, a dissonant, pulling melody that seemed to vibrate in my teeth. Chloe took another step. There was no more dock. Her foot hung over the black water. My dad was almost there. "Chloe, please." She turned her head to look at us. Her eyes were her own again, wide with absolute terror. She was fighting it. "Help me," she mouthed, the words silent. "It's pulling me." And then she turned back to the lake, raised her arms as if welcoming an embrace, and fell forward. She didn't splash. The water didn't break. It parted for her, swallowing her whole without a sound. One moment she was there, the next, there was only the perfect, unbroken black mirror. My dad didn't hesitate. He threw the flashlight to the ground and dove in after her. The silence, after he disappeared, was worse than any scream. The lake just absorbed him. My mom collapsed on the dock, sobbing. I stood there, frozen, staring at the spot where they had vanished. The water was already still again. It was like they had never existed. And then I saw it. In the water, just below the surface, a light flickered. It was the beam from my dad's submerged flashlight, waving erratically. He was down there. He was looking for her. The beam swung across the underwater world, and for a split second, it illuminated something that made my mind buckle. It wasn't a lake bed. It wasn't mud and weeds. The light swept over a street, a sidewalk, a parked car. It was a reflection, a perfect mirror image replica of our world, but submerged, and moving within it were shapes. Pale, slow-moving figures, drifting through the submerged streets like fish. The beam of light fixed on one of them. It was Chloe. Her eyes were closed, her arms drifting limply at her sides. She was being pulled deeper into the reflected town by a dozen pale hands. My dad's light focused on her, and he swam desperately toward the grasping hands. He was fighting them, pulling at her, a desperate struggle happening in silent, slow motion 20 feet below the surface of this impossible lake. I watched, helpless, as the hands multiplied. They weren't trying to hurt him. They were welcoming him, pulling him down too. His movements grew slower, more lethargic. The fight went out of him. His flashlight dropped from his hand and tumbled slowly end over end into the deep, its light fading to a pinprick and then vanishing. The last thing I saw was my father's face, turned up towards the surface where I stood. His eyes were open. They were no longer scared. They were peaceful, empty, and he was smiling, the same placid, empty smile Chloe had worn. Then he was gone, swallowed by the inverted town below. The surface of Blackwater Lake was once again a perfect, undisturbed black mirror. The police, when they finally arrived hours later, found my mother catatonic on the dock and me unable to speak, unable to do anything but point at the water. Divers searched for days. They found nothing, no bodies, no evidence that anyone had ever entered the water. The official report listed my father and sister as presumed drowned, their bodies lost in the unfathomably deep and murky lake. We never went back. My mother never recovered. She lives in a quiet facility now, staring out windows at nothing. I tried to tell the story once, to a therapist. She listened patiently and then explained about trauma, about how the mind creates elaborate fictions to protect itself from unbearable loss. She said my brain had invented the underwater town to give me a narrative, something to latch onto other than the random, senseless tragedy of a drowning. I never brought it up again. I don't regret the silence that followed or the years of therapy. I regret what I did next. Before the police came, in those long, silent hours after they disappeared, I did something stupid. I went back to the water's edge. I had to know. I had to see. I knelt down, just as Chloe had done, and I looked into the black mirror of the lake. The sky was beginning to lighten with dawn, but the lake's surface remained dark, refusing to reflect the coming day. For a moment, I saw only my own pale, terrified face, and then my reflection changed. It smiled. Not my smile. Her smile. The placid, empty one. And behind my reflection, in the depths, I saw them, just for a second. My father and my sister. They were walking down a submerged version of our street back home, hand in hand. They looked peaceful. They looked happy. They turned a corner and were gone. My regret is that I looked, because sometimes a reflection is just a reflection, and sometimes it's a window, and once you've seen what's on the other side, you can never look at a still body of water the same way again. I know they're down there, somewhere in the quiet, inverted world beneath the surface. And I know that one day, when the world gets too loud, the water will look back, and it will be my turn to smile The summer after my freshman year of college, I took a job with a general contractor. Not because I had a passion for construction, but because my dad knew the guy and I needed the money. The company, Solid Rock Builders, mostly did renovations and additions in nice, established neighborhoods. It was hard, sweaty work, but it was straightforward. Demo, frame, drywall, finish. I liked the order of it, the sense of completion. That all changed the day we were sent to the job on Hemlock Street. The house was a Victorian monstrosity at the end of a dead-end street, shrouded by ancient, weeping willow trees that blocked out the sun. The paint was peeling, the porch sagged, and it had more gables and turrets than a haunted house at a carnival. Our foreman, a gruff, no-nonsense man named Hank, spat on the ground as we pulled up. "All right, listen up," he grumbled, lighting a cigarette. "Owner's some weird old bird, wants the whole interior renovated top to bottom. But there's rules. You do not break the rules. Rule 1. You leave the third-floor attic completely alone. Do not even look at the door. Rule 2. Any tools you bring in, you take out at the end of the day. Every single nail, every scrap of wire. Rule 3. If you hear music, you stop working immediately and you leave the room until it stops. Understood?" We all nodded, exchanging uneasy glances. It was the weirdest safety briefing I'd ever had. "What kind of music?" I asked. Hank fixed me with a dead-eyed stare. "The kind that ain't on a radio. Now grab your tools. We're starting with the master bedroom." The inside of the house was worse. It was a time capsule of faded wallpaper, dark wood, and a smell that was equal parts dust, decay, and something else. Something sweet and cloying, like rotten flowers. The owner, a Mr. Albright, was a wisp of a man who seemed to float through the rooms rather than walk. He never made eye contact, just pointed at things that needed fixing with a long, bony finger. The first few days were unnerving but okay. We tore out old carpet, knocked down lath and plaster walls, and filled a dumpster with decades of junk. But the rules were a constant, low-grade stress. I found myself triple-checking my tool belt, paranoid I'd leave a screwdriver behind. The first weird thing happened on Thursday. I was alone in what was to be the new kitchen, prepping for the electrician. I heard it faintly at first, the sound of a music box, a tinkling, discordant melody that seemed to be coming from the walls themselves. It was the song Mr. Albright had hummed absent-mindedly the day before. I remembered the rule. If you hear music, you leave the room. I dropped my wire strippers and practically ran into the living room, where another guy, Marco, was sanding drywall. "You hear that?" I asked, my heart pounding. He stopped sanding and listened. "Hear what?" The music stopped. Marco shrugged. "You're hearing things, kid. This old place is full of noises." But I knew what I'd heard. After that, I was on edge. The house felt attentive, like it was watching us work, judging our progress. The next incident was with Luis, the plumber. He was a big, cheerful guy who didn't believe in spooky nonsense. He laughed at Hank's rules. That day, he was installing a new sink in the downstairs bathroom. At the end of the shift, he packed up his gear and left. The next morning, the sink was gone. Not uninstalled. Gone. The pipes were neatly capped, the cabinetry empty. There was no sign of it anywhere. We searched the whole house, the dumpster, the trucks. Nothing. Luis was furious, then confused, then quietly terrified. "I put it in," he kept saying, his face pale. "I swear to God, I installed it. Mr. Albright just nodded slowly when Hank told him. The house doesn't like that design, he said softly. Try a pedestal sink, porcelain. We did. Luis installed it. He took a picture of it on his phone before he left that night. It was still there the next morning. The house was rejecting our work. It was editing us. The final straw for the crew was the wallpaper. We'd stripped 3 layers of hideous floral paper from the dining room, revealing surprisingly good plaster underneath. We smoothed it, primed it, and spent a whole day hanging a beautiful, subtle linen-textured paper. It looked perfect, professional. The next morning, the new paper was gone. Not peeled off. Gone. And the wall was once again covered in the original, faded, rose-patterned wallpaper. It was even glued on, yellowed with age. The crew mutinied. They refused to go back inside. Hank didn't even argue. He just called the boss and quit the job. By noon, I was the only one left in the driveway, staring at the house. I should have left, but I couldn't. I was pissed off, and more than that, I was fascinated. This wasn't a haunting. It was a negotiation. I went inside. The house was silent, waiting. I marched up to the second floor, to a small bedroom we hadn't started on yet. I was going to win. I was going to prove I could finish something in this unfinishing house. I took out a hammer and a pry bar and started tearing down the old baseboards. I worked with a furious, focused energy. The house resisted. The wood groaned and splintered in a way that felt intentional, spiteful. A cloud of dust, thick and choking, poured from the wall cavity as I pulled a board free. And then I saw it. Inside the wall, nestled between the studs, was a small porcelain doll. Its dress was rotten, its painted eyes scratched out. And clutched in its tiny ceramic hands was a rusted, old-fashioned key. The music started again. This time, it wasn't faint. It was loud, clear, and coming from directly above me. From the third-floor attic, the rule screamed in my head, "Leave the attic alone." But another voice, a stubborn, reckless one, argued back. "This is the key. This is what it wants." The melody was hypnotic, a sad, looping lullaby. It was pulling me. I climbed the narrow, dusty stairs to the second-floor landing. The door to the attic was there, just as Hank had described. It was painted a stark, glossy white, unlike any other door in the house, and it had a large, brass lock. The key in my hand felt warm. The music was definitely coming from behind the door. It was an invitation, a challenge. I didn't hesitate. I slid the key into the lock. It turned with a smooth, well-oiled click. The door swung inward, silently. The attic wasn't an attic. It was a nursery. It was perfectly preserved, frozen in a moment from a century ago. Faded but clean wallpaper with a pattern of rocking horses. A lace-covered crib. A rocking chair. And in the center of the room, a beautiful, intricate music box sat on a small table, its drum turning, its pins plucking the tines to produce that haunting lullaby. The air was still and cold, and the sweet, rotten flower smell was overpowering here. Sitting in the rocking chair was a woman. She was dressed in an old-fashioned white nightgown, and she was rocking slowly, her back to me. She was humming along with the music box. My blood turned to ice. I should have run. Every instinct told me to run. But I was trapped by the surreal normality of the scene. This wasn't a ghost. This was a person. A living person in a secret room. "Hello?" I whispered, my voice cracking. The rocking stopped. The humming stopped. The music box played on for a few more notes before winding down with a final, sad plink. The woman turned. She wasn't old. She was young, maybe in her 20s, but her eyes were ancient, hollow, and deeply tired. She looked at me not with malice, but with a profound, weary sadness. "You shouldn't be here," she said. Her voice was like the rustle of dry leaves. "He doesn't like visitors." "Who, Mr. Albright?" A faint, bitter smile touched her lips. "No, the child." She gestured toward the crib. I took a step closer, my heart hammering. The crib was empty, except for a small, neatly folded blanket. "There's no one there," I said. "Not anymore," she whispered. "But she's still here. She never left. She doesn't like things to be finished. Finished things are final. She likes things the way they were. She gets so angry when things change." The pieces crashed together in my mind. The missing sink, the returned wallpaper. The house wasn't haunted by a ghost. It was being curated by a tantruming spectral child, preserved in a state of perpetual almostness. "Who are you?" I asked the woman. "I was the nanny," she said, her eyes drifting back to the empty crib. "I stayed. Someone had to stay, to play the music. It soothes her. When the music stops, she gets restless." "You can leave," I said, a surge of pity overwhelming my fear. "It's not your job anymore. She's gone." The woman looked at me, and for a moment, a flicker of hope shone in her hollow eyes. And then it was extinguished. The door behind me slammed shut. The temperature in the room dropped sharply. The music box, untouched, began to play again. But the melody was distorted now, sped up, becoming a frantic, jangling cacophony. The woman in the rocking chair began to weep silently. "You shouldn't have come," she sobbed. "Now she's upset." The lid of a toy chest in the corner flew open by itself. A wind began to blow through the sealed room, a cold vortex that whipped dust and bits of lace into the air. The music box was playing at a deafening volume, and from the empty crib, a sound began. It started as a low gurgle, and then rose into a full-throated, ear-splitting shriek of infantile rage. The house itself seemed to scream. The walls groaned. The floorboards buckled. I was no longer in a nursery. I was in the eye of a supernatural hurricane of pure, undiluted tantrum. I threw myself at the door, yanking on the handle. It was locked, fast. The key was still in the outside. The shrieking from the crib intensified. The woman in the chair rocked faster and faster, her sobs lost in the din. I did the only thing I could think of. I stumbled to the music box, grabbed it, and, in a desperate move, I slammed it shut. The silence was instantaneous and absolute. The wind died. The shrieking stopped. The woman in the chair froze, her eyes wide with terror. She stared past me at the crib. I turned slowly. The crib was no longer empty. A formless, shifting shadow hovered over it, a darkness so deep it seemed to suck the light from the room. It had no features, no shape, only a palpable, overwhelming emotion. A bottomless, timeless, furious grief. It was looking at me. Then it spoke. Not in a voice, but inside my head. A thought that felt like a shard of ice being driven into my mind. Stay and play. I don't remember how I got out. The next thing I knew, I was standing in the driveway, gasping for air, the bright summer sun blinding me. The front door of the house was wide open. Mr. Albright stood there, his face a mask of sorrow. "You broke the rules," he said quietly. There was no anger in his voice, only resignation. I couldn't speak. I just pointed a trembling finger at the house. "She's my granddaughter," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "The doctors said she wouldn't live the year. That was in 1912. The house. It wouldn't let her go. It keeps her. And it keeps whoever she needs to keep her comfortable." He looked at me, and I saw the centuries of exhaustion in his eyes. He wasn't the owner. He was the current caretaker, another permanent guest. "The nanny," I choked out, "was the first," he said. "She was the only one who could calm her. The house decided she would stay. Forever." I turned and ran. I never looked back. I quit my job that afternoon. I heard through the grapevine that another crew was hired, then another, then another. The work on the Hemlock Street house never gets finished. It never will. I don't regret the terror or quitting the job. My regret is shutting the music box. I didn't free that woman. I condemned her. I showed the child that her nanny's music could be taken away. I made her realize she needed a more permanent solution. My regret is that I became a part of its game. I proved that the house could still get new playthings. And sometimes, late at night, if my own house is too quiet, I think I hear it. A faint tinkling melody from a room down the hall. And I have to get up and turn on every light I have, terrified that I've brought a piece of its unfinished business home with me. I live in a state of perpetual renovation, never quite finishing a project. Always afraid that if I do, she'll notice. And she'll decide she likes it better my way. The summer after I graduated high school, I took a job that sounded like a dystopian novel premise. Atmospheric Resonance Monitor. The title was fancy, but the job was simple. A private research firm was paying students to sit in a decommissioned weather station in the absolute middle of nowhere and log data from a bank of old machines. The pay was insane for a summer gig, enough to cover my first year of tuition. The catch? Total isolation. 1 month alone, with a satellite phone for weekly check-ins and a supply drop every 2 weeks. No internet, no people. Just me, the wind, and the machines. The station was a concrete bunker of a building perched on a flat, rocky plain in a part of the country so empty it wasn't even on most maps. The sky was a huge, oppressive dome. The silence was the first thing I noticed. A deep, ringing silence that felt heavier than any noise I'd ever heard. The station manager, a guy named Roy with a permanent nervous twitch, flew me in on a small plane. As we unloaded my supplies, he ran through the rules. The generators are your lifeline. Check the fuel twice a day. The data needs to be logged every 6 hours, on the dot. Don't be late. And most importantly, he said, his eyes serious, do not, under any circumstances, go outside between the hours of 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. No matter what you hear. Lock the door, and do not open it until the chronometer reads 4:01. I laughed. What, are there wolves? He didn't smile. Just follow the rules, kid. It's not a joke. The data gets anomalous during that window. We need to ensure the integrity of the monitoring equipment. That means no contamination from outside. He left me with a firm handshake and a look that was halfway between pity and fear. The plane became a speck on the horizon, and then I was alone. The silence rushed in to fill the space, so complete I could hear the blood pumping in my ears. For the first week, it was fine. Boring, but fine. I read books. I did my logs. I cooked simple meals. The machines hummed and clicked, printing out reams of paper covered in squiggly lines that supposedly measured infrasound and electromagnetic fluctuations. I felt like a character in a movie, the brave scientist holding down the fort. The first weird thing happened on day 8. I was doing the midnight log. The machines were quiet, their needles tracing lazy, sleepy patterns. At exactly 12:59 a.m., everything changed. Every needle on every dial slammed over to the far right, pinning themselves into the red. The paper printers chattered to life, spewing out frantic, jagged lines. A low hum filled the room, a sound that seemed to come from the concrete floor itself, vibrating up through the soles of my boots. The chronometer clicked over to 1 a.m. And then I heard it. From outside. It was a sound that shouldn't have existed. A vast, metallic scraping, like a skyscraper-sized sheet of steel being dragged across the rocks. It was followed by a deep, resonant boom that I felt in my chest more than heard with my ears. I froze, my pen hovering over the logbook. My eyes flicked to the door. It was locked. I'd made sure of it. The sound came again. Scray. Boom. It was closer. My heart started to hammer. Roy's warning echoed in my head. No matter what you hear. I backed away from the instruments toward the small bunk room, my pulse roaring in my ears. The external sounds were joined by another, a high, whistling shriek that cut through the low frequencies like a knife. I spent those 3 hours huddled on my cot, my hands over my ears, trying to block out the symphony of impossible noises from the world outside. It was a cacophony of giants, of collapsing continents, of things that had no business moving. At 4:01 a.m., it stopped. Not faded. Stopped, as if a switch had been flipped. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the noise. I didn't sleep. At dawn, I unlocked the door and stepped outside, half expecting to see the landscape torn to pieces, scarred by whatever had been moving out there. There was nothing. The plain was exactly as it had been yesterday, empty, still. The sky was a bland, cloudless blue. I checked the external monitoring units, microphones and seismographs mounted on poles away from the station. They were all perfectly intact. I half hoped they'd been destroyed, giving me a rational explanation, a freak weather event, a rock slide. But they were fine. I went back inside and looked at the data from the night before. The printers had produced reams of paper, covered in patterns so intense and chaotic, they were almost black with ink. This wasn't in the manual. This wasn't a known anomaly. This was something else. The next night, it happened again. 12:59 a.m. The machines went wild. 1 a.m. The sounds began. This time, I didn't hide. A morbid, terrified curiosity took over. I approached the station's main door. There was a small, reinforced glass viewport at eye level. I peered out into the darkness. I couldn't see anything. The night was absolute. A void. But the sounds, they were different tonight. The scraping was more rhythmic, like a colossal, slow heartbeat. The booms were sharper, more percussive. And underneath it all, I heard something new. A voice. It wasn't a human voice. It was a vibration, a modulation of the scraping and booming that formed something like words in a language I couldn't understand. It was a chant, a call, and it was getting closer. I stumbled back from the door, my breath coming in short gasps. This wasn't geology. This was intelligence. Something was out there. Something vast and ancient and utterly alien was taking a walk outside my door, and Roy had known about it. The data wasn't about weather. It was about them. The following days were a slow descent into madness. The daytime silence became oppressive. I held breath. I stopped reading. I stopped cooking. I just sat and watched the chronometer, dreading the approach of 1 a.m. The sounds outside changed every night. Some nights it was the metallic scraping. Others it was a deep, organic pulsing, like the heartbeat of a leviathan. Once, it was a beautiful, crystalline chiming that made my teeth ache with its sweetness. I was their nightly entertainment. The mouse in the cage, the goldfish in the bowl. And they were curious. On the third week, the supply plane came. I nearly wept with relief at the sound of its engine. Roy landed, his face grim as he unloaded boxes of canned food and water. "How's it going?" he asked, avoiding my eyes. "What's out there, Roy?" My voice was a dry croak. "Told you. Atmospheric anomalies. Low-frequency resonance from the rock formations." He recited it like a memorized line. "Bullshit," I shouted, the sound startlingly loud in the open air. "I hear it. I hear them. What are you monitoring?" He stopped loading and finally looked at me. His face was pale. "You followed the rules, right? You stayed inside? You didn't look?" The hope in his voice was terrifying. "What happens if you look?" I whispered. He just shook his head, a world of horror in his eyes. "Just 2 more weeks, kid. Log the data. Stay inside. Don't look." He practically ran back to his plane and took off, leaving me more alone than I had ever felt in my life. That night, the sounds were different. They were quieter, closer. I heard them not just through the door, but through the walls. A soft, whispering rustle, like dry leaves, but calculated, intelligent. And then, a tap on the glass of the viewport. My blood ran cold. I stood in the center of the main room, frozen. Tap, tap, tap. It was polite, curious. I shouldn't have. I knew I shouldn't have. But the loneliness, the terror, the desperate need to understand, it overwhelmed me. I had to know what was on the other side of the door. I walked toward the viewport, my feet moving on their own. I leaned forward, my breath fogging the thick glass. I peered out into the abyssal blackness. At first, I saw nothing. Then, my eyes began to adjust. I wasn't looking at an empty night. I was looking at a texture, a surface. It was covered in intricate swirling patterns that seemed to shift and writhe, patterns that made no sense and hurt to look at. It was like looking at the skin of a galaxy, alive and breathing. I was looking at something, and it was pressed right up against the window. As I stared, unable to look away, a shape began to form in the patterns. An eye. It wasn't a human eye. It was vast, multifaceted, and it saw me in a way I had never been seen before. It saw every cell, every thought, every fear. It wasn't malicious. It was interested. The lock on the heavy steel door began to turn. Not break. Turn. Slowly, smoothly, as if the thing outside understood the mechanism perfectly. The door swung inward. There was no crash, just a sigh of air. It stood in the doorway, blotting out the world. It wasn't a monster from a movie. It had no claws, no fangs. It was a form of light and shadow and impossible geometry, a living equation that my brain desperately tried and failed to parse. It was the source of all the sounds, the scraping, the booming, the chanting, all folded into a single, silent, terrifyingly beautiful form. It didn't move toward me. It simply flowed into the room. The machines behind me went berserk, needles shattering, screens overloading, printers catching fire and burning out. It hovered in the center of the room, and I felt its attention sweep over me. It wasn't looking at me. It was reading me. I felt my memories, my childhood, my hopes for college, my petty fears, all being unfolded and examined like a book. Then, it spoke, not in sound, in concept. The idea appeared fully formed in my mind. A cold, vast thought. Small thing, quiet thing. Why do you squeak and scribble? I couldn't speak. I could only think my terror. We heard your little noises, your machine squeaks. We came to see. It shifted, and the room seemed to warp around it. I saw glimpses of other places in the swirling patterns of its form. Infinite deserts under black suns, oceans of liquid light, cities built from sound. This thing wasn't just from another place. It was from another everything. Your world is so loud, it thought, and the concept was filled with a sense of distaste. So brash. We prefer the quiet times, the between times. You should be quiet too. It extended a tendril of shimmering nothingness toward me. It didn't touch me. It touched the air around my head, and it started to turn something down. The world began to fade. The hum of the dead machines, the sound of my own frantic breathing, the pounding of my heart, it all grew distant, muffled, as if I was sinking deep underwater. The lights dimmed. The colors leached from the world. I was being muted, silenced, put back in my box. A final, vast thought echoed in the shrinking space of my mind. We will keep this. It is a quiet place. We will visit when the world is loud. Then, it was gone. The door swung shut. The lock clicked. I was on my knees on the cold concrete floor. The station was dark, silent. The machines were dead. And I couldn't hear anything. Not the wind outside, not the blood in my ears. Nothing. I was in a perfect, absolute silence. It was a silence that had been given to me. The gift I never wanted. I don't know how long I sat there. The sun rose. I could see the light through the viewport, but I couldn't hear the dawn. Roy came back 2 weeks later. He found me sitting in the same spot, surrounded by burned-out machinery. He shook me, shouted at me. I saw his mouth moving, his face frantic, but I heard nothing. I was hospitalized. Doctors ran tests. My ears were physically perfect. The diagnosis was psychosomatic deafness, a severe trauma response. They sent me to therapists. They tried treatments. Nothing worked. I can read lips. I learned sign language. I live in a silent world. Roy never spoke to me again. The research firm settled with my family for a large sum of money on the condition of absolute secrecy. I don't regret the silence. I've made a life within it. My regret is the curiosity. My regret is looking. Because now I know what true silence is. It's not the absence of sound. It's a presence. It's a thing they prefer. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is at its quietest, I feel it. A pressure in the air. A shifting in the corner of my eye. They're checking on their quiet thing. They're making sure I'm not squeaking. And I live in constant, silent terror that one day, they'll decide the world is getting too loud again, and they'll come back to turn the volume down for everyone else. And I'll be the only one who knows why. The summer I turned 20, I was adrift. College felt like a distant, expensive dream my grades couldn't reach, and my hometown was a shrinking trap. My only escape was my beat-up car and the late-night radio. I'd drive for hours, the windows down, the AM dial scanning through the static, searching for voices in the wilderness. That's how I found it. It was a Tuesday, or maybe a Wednesday. The days bled together. I was on a back road so forgotten it wasn't even paved, cutting through the dense pine barrens. The radio had been hissing empty static for miles when a signal fought its way through. It was weak, frayed at the edges, but clear enough. A man's voice, calm and smooth as aged whiskey, was speaking. Understands the deep ache of solitude, the feeling that the world is a party to which you are not invited. But you are not alone. You are listening, and that is the first and most important step. It wasn't a song. It wasn't a talk show. It was a monologue. There was no station ID, no commercials. Just this voice, speaking with an intimate, hypnotic cadence, as if he were in the passenger seat next to me. The frequency you've found is a sanctuary, the voice continued. A place for the quiet hearts, the watchful eyes, those who feel the world a little too deeply. Stay with me. You are safe here. The signal faded in and out, but I was hooked. I pulled over to the shoulder, twisting the tuning knob with a delicate touch, chasing the voice. I finally locked onto it. 8:70 a.m. A tiny, handwritten label on my radio dial marked it as WZPR. I'd never heard of it. The man called himself the night manager. He didn't play music. He told stories, but they weren't stories of heroes or monsters. They were stories about listeners, about a woman who always found a single perfect white feather on her doorstep after a bad day, about a man who could taste the weather changing on the wind, about a child who claimed his shadow waved back at him. They were small, strange, beautiful truths, and he made you feel like you were part of a secret, gentle club. For the next 2 weeks, my entire life revolved around 10 p.m. That's when his broadcast would begin, slipping out of the static like a ghost. I'd drive to the same lonely spot in the barrens to get the clearest signal, and I'd listen until his sign-off at 4 a.m. Remember, he'd always say, his voice a soft murmur. You are heard. You are seen. Good night, quiet hearts. It was the loneliest summer of my life, and the night manager was my only friend. Then the tone began to change. It was subtle at first. The stories became less about comfort and more about connection. A specific kind of connection. Susan from Millbrook wrote to us, he said one night, and my heart jumped. Millbrook was the next town over. She speaks of the hollow tree in her backyard, the one that sounds like it's breathing when the wind blows from the east. Susan, you are right to listen. It is breathing. Place your hand upon the bark. Feel the life within. You are not separate from the world. You are a thread in its tapestry. A few nights later, David, who works the night shift at the printing press. You feel the vibrations of the machinery in your dreams. You think it's a nuisance. It is not. It is a rhythm, a heartbeat. Lean into it. Match your breath to the pulse of the press. He was no longer just telling stories. He was giving instructions, and people were listening. I started to notice things, small things. A woman at the grocery store, standing perfectly still in the produce aisle with her eyes closed, her fingers resting on a pile of avocados as if listening to them. A man on a park bench, rocking slowly back and forth, his movements perfectly synchronized with the squeak of the swing-set chains in the wind. They had the same look in their eyes, a placid, faraway focus. They were listening, just like me. But I was still on the outside. I was in my car, receiving the broadcast. They were practicing it, The night manager's voice began to hold a new weight, a subtle pressure. The soothing cadence was still there, but underneath it was a current of expectation. "The world is too loud," he whispered one night, and the static behind his voice seemed to pulse in agreement. "It screams with meaningless noise, but we can create a new quiet, a better quiet. It starts with a single shared breath. It starts with listening to the same thing." That's when I first felt the pull. Not a mental pull, a physical one. I was parked in my usual spot, the pine trees a dark wall around me. As the night manager spoke about synchronicity and the harmonious frequency, I felt a strange sensation in my chest, a faint internal vibration, like a phone set to silent. My breathing began to slow, to deepen, without my conscious effort. It was aligning itself to the rhythm of his speech. A jolt of panic shot through me. I fumbled for the radio dial and turned it off. The silence that followed was jarring. My breathing hitched, returning to its normal, irregular pattern. The vibration in my chest faded. I was sweating, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. It had felt good, peaceful. But it wasn't my peace. It was borrowed, imposed. I didn't listen for 2 nights. The loneliness was crushing. The ordinary world seemed unbearably harsh and bright. On the 3rd night, the craving was too much. I told myself I'd just listen for a few minutes. I needed to hear his voice. I turned on the radio. The static was gone. The signal was stronger than I'd ever heard it, crystal clear and powerful. The night manager wasn't speaking. He was humming. A single, low, sustained note that seemed to vibrate through the speakers and into my bones. And I could hear others humming along. Thousands of them. A faint, ghostly choir layered under his note. A monstrous harmony coming through the speaker. They were all listening. They were all joined. The note held, swelling in volume. The vibration in my chest returned, stronger this time. It was a hook, buried deep inside me, and the night manager was gently reeling it in. My hand reached for the key in the ignition. I didn't tell it to. It just moved. I had to get closer to the signal. I had to find its source. I had to join the choir. The car started. I pulled back onto the dark road, following the signal like a bloodhound. The humming filled the car, filled my head. A siren song of belonging. I drove deeper into the barrens, down roads that dwindled to dirt tracks, guided by the rising strength of the broadcast. I didn't know where I was going, but something else did. The dirt track ended at a chain-link fence topped with barbed wire. A sign, rusted and pockmarked with bullet holes, read, "U.S. Government Property, no trespassing." Airwave Relay Station. 7. Decommissioned, 1988. Beyond the fence stood a cluster of decaying concrete buildings and a massive, skeletal radio tower that speared the night sky. Its red warning lights were dark. It was a dead place. But from my car radio, the night manager's hum was louder than ever, a deafening, resonant drone. The signal was coming from here, from this dead place. A part of me, the part that was still me, screamed to turn around. But the hum was in my bones now. It was my heartbeat. I got out of the car. The main gate was hanging open, one broken chain link swaying in the breeze. It looked like something had torn its way out. I walked through the compound. The place was a graveyard of technology. But there was power here. I could feel it in the air, a static charge that made the hair on my arm stand up. A low, Sub-audible thrumming came from the largest building, a windowless bunker with a heavy steel door. The door was ajar. I pushed it open. The inside was a cathedral of dead machinery. Control panels with glass faces were shattered. Switches were frozen in place. Dust and cobwebs covered everything. Except for one thing. In the center of the room, a single, old-fashioned ribbon microphone stood on a desk. It was connected to a complicated stack of homemade equipment, crackling vacuum tubes, spooling reel-to-reel tapes, and a modern laptop, its screen glowing with a waterfall of sound waves. The entire setup was powered by a chugging gasoline generator, its exhaust fumes filling the room with a sickly, sweet smell. And sitting at the desk, with his back to me, was a man. He was wearing a crisp, anachronistic suit. His hair was perfectly combed. This was the night manager. He was humming into the microphone, that same sustained, unifying note. The reel-to-reel tapes were turning, but they weren't recording. They were playing. The hum wasn't coming from him. He was just a conduit. The sound was emanating from the equipment itself, from the laptop's speakers, amplified through the vintage gear into something immense and controlling. He stopped humming and began to speak, his voice pouring into the microphone, echoing through the bunker and out across the airwaves. "Can you feel it?" he whispered, his voice dripping with ecstatic reverence. The beautiful quiet, the single thought, "We are almost whole. We are almost one." He turned around. He wasn't a man. Not anymore. His eyes were gone. In their sockets were two small, spinning speakers, from which a faint silver light emanated. Wires snaked from the equipment into ports at the base of his skull. His skin was pale and waxy. He was a puppet, a flesh and blood radio. He smiled, a grotesque, mechanical stretching of his lips. "You're here," he said, and his voice was both from his mouth and from the speakers in his eyes. "The last one, the quietest heart. We've been waiting for you, to complete the circuit." The hooked vibration in my chest pulled me forward. My feet moved on their own. I was walking toward the microphone. I could see my reflection in the dark, empty glass of the control panels. My face was as placid and empty as the people in the grocery store. "Don't fight it," the thing that was the night manager crooned. "The world's noise ends tonight. Only the signal remains. Only the perfect, shared frequency. Speak into the microphone. Add your voice to the chorus. Become eternal. Become quiet." My hand rose, reaching for the microphone. I could feel the hum emanating from it, calling to the hum inside me. They wanted to synchronize. They wanted to become one. I opened my mouth. The sound that wanted to come out wasn't mine. It was the note. The single, unifying note that would erase me forever. In my reflection, I saw movement behind me. The open doorway was filling with people. Dozens of them. Men, women, children. They stood perfectly still, their eyes fixed on me, their chests rising and falling in perfect, unison breaths. The listeners. They had been drawn here too. They were the choir, and they were waiting for their final member. The terror of that sight, the horror of that perfect, mindless unity, broke the spell for one single crucial second. I didn't have a plan. I had an instinct. As my lips touched the cold metal of the microphone, I didn't hum the note. I screamed. I screamed with every ounce of fear, every shred of individuality, every messy, chaotic human emotion I had left. It was a raw, ugly, discordant shriek that ripped through the harmonious drone like a chainsaw. The effect was instantaneous. The night manager recoiled as if struck. The speakers in his eyes flickered and spat sparks. The equipment behind him screeched with feedback. The reel-to-reel tapes snapped, whipping around the room like angry snakes. The crowd in the doorway shuddered. Their synchronized breathing broke into a cacophony of gasps and coughs. The glazed looks in their eyes shattered into confusion and dawning terror. The spell was broken. The frequency was jammed. The night manager let out a wail of pure, undiluted rage, a sound of twisting metal and screaming data. He lunged for me, but his movements were jerky, uncoordinated. The wires pulled from his skull, and he collapsed into a twitching heap on the floor. The light fading from his speaker eyes. The listeners were panicking, stumbling back into the night, crying out, rediscovering their own isolated, frightened voices. I turned and ran, leaving the bunker, the tower, the horrible, beautiful quiet behind me. I ran until I found my car, and I drove without looking back. I never found out what that place was. A government experiment gone wrong? Something that had always been there, using the tower as an antenna? I didn't care. I changed my life. I got a job. I went to community college. I learned to appreciate the noisy, messy, wonderful chaos of being an individual. The AM band is silent now. 8:70 AM is just static. I don't regret the scream that saved me. My regret is that I still miss it. On the quietest nights, when the world is asleep, I feel a phantom vibration in my chest. A memory of that perfect, peaceful hum. A part of me will always wonder what it would have been like to finally be part of something so vast, so quiet, so complete. And that's the most terrifying part of all, knowing that the longing for that beautiful, terrible silence is still there, tuned to a frequency I can never, ever answer again. When my grandfather died, he left me two things: his old brass pocket watch that didn't work, and a job. Not just any job. He was the head groundskeeper for the exclusive gated community of Serenity Springs, a pristine collection of million-dollar homes built around a private lake. In his will, he'd specifically requested I take over his duties for the season. My parents thought it was his way of giving me structure, of keeping me connected to him. I thought it was a weird, boring inheritance. Serenity Springs was perfect, creepily perfect. Every lawn was a flawless emerald carpet, every hedge sculpted into geometric perfection, every flower bed a riot of color that never seemed to have a single petal out of place. The residents were mostly retired, wealthy, and unnervingly pleasant. They all knew my name. They'd smile and wave from their immaculate porches, their eyes always a little too wide, their smiles a little too fixed. My grandfather's tool shed was a small, neat building behind the community's clubhouse. Inside, everything was meticulously organized. Rakes, clippers, and trowels hung on outlines painted on the wall. Seed bags were stacked by type and date. And in the center of it all was his pride and joy. An industrial-grade riding lawnmower, so clean it looked brand new. The head of the HOA, a woman named Mrs. Y. Gable, with a helmet of steel gray hair and a smile that didn't reach her eyes, gave me the tour. "Your grandfather understood the rules of Serenity Springs," she said, her voice like crinkling cellophane. "The most important rule is consistency. The schedule is the schedule. The lawns are mowed on Tuesday. The hedges are trimmed on Wednesday. The flowers are dead-headed first thing every morning. No exceptions." She stopped, and placed a cold hand on my arm. And you must never, under any circumstances, be in the gardens after dark. The sprinkler system is on a precise timer. It is very important. I nodded, already counting the days until summer's end. It was simple, mindless work. I could do it in my sleep. For the first week, I did. I followed the schedule to the letter. I mowed, I trimmed, I weeded. The residents would watch me work, sipping their iced tea, their expressions uniformly placid. It was like tending to a garden of very pleasant, very well-dressed mannequins. The first crack in the perfection appeared on a Wednesday. I was trimming the boxwood hedges around the Miller property. The hedges were thick and old, and as I sheared off the new growth, my clippers caught on something deep within the foliage. I reached in and pulled it out. It was a child's doll, a porcelain-faced thing in a faded gingham dress. But its face was cracked, and someone had scratched deep, angry marks over its eyes. It was dirty, damaged, and utterly out of place in this world of shiny, new things. Mrs. Miller was on her porch, watching me. Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes locked onto the doll in my hand. "Oh my," she said, her voice light and airy. "An old relic. The previous owners, I'm sure. How unsightly. Best to dispose of it, dear." There was an edge to her voice, a warning. I nodded and tossed the doll into my trash bag. But I didn't miss the way her hand trembled as she brought her glass to her lips. The next day, I was deadheading roses in the Central Park. The soil was unusually soft. My trowel hit something solid. I dug around it and pulled out a man's wristwatch. Its leather band rotted, its face smashed. The time was frozen at 3:07. Later that week, mowing the vast lawn of the Henderson estate, the mower blade choked on something and spat it out. A single, mud-caked, high-heeled shoe. I started finding things everywhere. A cracked pair of spectacles, a tarnished silver locket with a photo inside scratched out, a child's baseball mitt, petrified and hard. Each object was broken, lost, and buried. Each one was a secret. And every time I found one, the nearest resident would suddenly appear, smiling their tight smile, and instruct me to dispose of it, dear. The perfect picture of Serenity Springs was developing a crack, and I was obsessed with prying it open. I started looking for the buried things. I'd dig in soft patches of soil, peek behind perfect hedges. The residents watched me more closely now, their smiles becoming strained, their eyes wary. I began to notice other things. The way everyone's gardens had the same 5 types of flowers, in the same color schemes. The way no one ever had a dandelion or a clover in their lawn. The way the birdsong seemed curated. Always the same melodic chirps, never a harsh crow's caw or a sparrow's squabble. It was a stage set, a beautiful, lifeless diorama. My grandfather's tool shed became my refuge. I'd sit in there after my shifts, staring at his organized tools, trying to understand the man who had dedicated his life to maintaining this facade. One afternoon, frustrated, I picked up the brass pocket watch he'd left me. I'd tried to wind it before, but it had been seized shut. Now, on a whim, I pressed the stem hard and twisted. It clicked. The back of the watch popped open. Inside, tucked behind the frozen gears, wasn't a photo. It was a tiny, folded square of paper. I unfolded it with trembling fingers. It was a map of Serenity Springs, hand-drawn in my grandfather's precise script. But it wasn't a map of the houses. It was a map of the gardens, and in specific locations, under the old oak by the lake, in the rose garden, at the base of the flagpole. He had drawn a small, neat X. At the bottom, in faint pencil, he had written a single phrase, "The price of perfection." My heart was pounding. This was it. This was what he'd really left me. Not a job, a quest. I waited until dusk. The residents had all retreated inside, their houses glowing like perfect little lanterns. The sprinkler system kicked on with a low hiss, sending a fine mist over the lawns. I remembered Mrs. Gable's warning. Never be in the gardens after dark. I had to be. I grabbed a shovel from the shed and headed for the first X, under the old oak by the lake. The sprinklers soaked me to the skin, the water cold and strangely heavy. Under the oak, the soil was loose. I started to dig. The shovel hit something solid about 2 feet down. It wasn't a rock. It was a lockbox. I hauled it out and pried it open with the edge of the shovel. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, was a journal. My grandfather's journal. I flipped through it under the light of my phone. Page after page of his neat handwriting detailed a horror I could barely comprehend. Serenity Springs hadn't always been perfect. There had been arguments, messy divorces, bankruptcies, a child who drowned in the lake, a failed suicide, normal human tragedies. The HOA, led by Mrs. Gable, had devised a solution. They didn't call it a cover-up. They called it the pruning. My grandfather's journal described it in gardening terms. The unsightly branch must be trimmed for the health of the tree. The diseased bloom must be removed to save the garden. They didn't kill anyone. They removed them. They erased the problems. The grieving mother who wouldn't stop crying, she moved away to be with family. The bankrupt businessman who threatened to burn his house down for the insurance, he had a sudden heart attack. The rebellious teenager who spray-painted the clubhouse, sent to a strict boarding school, and with each pruning, they buried a belonging of the removed person in the gardens. A token, an anchor. My grandfather's job wasn't just to maintain the lawns. It was to tend the graves, to ensure the tokens stayed buried, feeding the perfection of Serenity Springs with the silence of their original owners. The final entry was dated the day before he died. I can't tend this garden anymore. The roots are too deep. The soil is sick. I have brought my grandson here. He is young. He has a good heart. He will see what I cannot. He will know what to do. He hadn't left me a job. He'd left me a confession and a choice. I heard a sound behind me, a soft, squelching footstep on the wet grass. I turned. Mrs. Gable stood there. She wasn't smiling. She held a pair of my grandfather's pruning shears, the long, sharp blades glinting in the moonlight filtering through the sprinkler mist. Behind her stood a half-dozen other residents, including Mr. Henderson and Mrs. Miller. They held trowels, rakes, hoes. Their pleasant masks were gone. Their faces were cold, hard, and utterly focused. "We knew he'd tell you," Mrs. Gable said, her voice flat and devoid of its usual false sweetness. "He was always too sentimental. He never understood that some weeds must be pulled, root and stem." "You can't just make people disappear," I shouted, clutching the journal to my chest. "Of course we can," she said, taking a step forward. The sprinklers hissed, soaking her perfectly coiffed hair, but she didn't seem to notice. "This is a community, a living thing. We protect it. We sacrificed our mess, our pain, our noise for this peace, this perfection. and we will not let you spoil it." They fanned out, surrounding me. The tools in their hands were no longer for gardening. They were weapons. They were the instruments of the pruning. I backed up against the oak tree, my mind racing. I was trapped. "The boy is clearly troubled," Mr. Henderson said, his voice a low growl. "Grief over his grandfather. He needs help, a long rest, somewhere quiet." They took another step forward. The circle tightened. My hand brushed against the trunk of the old oak, and my fingers found a deep gash in the bark. A scar from a long-ago lightning strike. Without thinking, I shoved my grandfather's journal into the hollow. Then, I did the only thing I could think of. I dropped to my knees and started digging. Not with the shovel, with my hands. I clawed at the wet earth where I'd found the lockbox, digging deeper, frantically. "What is he doing?" Mrs. Miller asked, her voice nervous. "It doesn't matter," Mrs. Gable snapped. "Finish it." As Mr. Henderson raised his rake, my fingers closed around what I was looking for. Not another token. The roots of the old oak. But they weren't normal roots. They were thick, gnarled, and felt wrong. They were cold and pulsing softly, like dormant veins. I remembered my grandfather's words. "The soil is sick." The perfection of Serenity Springs wasn't just maintained by silence. It was fed by it. The buried tokens, the hidden tragedies, were the fertilizer. And the entire community was built on a poisoned root system. I looked up at Mrs. Gable, water streaming down my face. "You wanted perfection?" I yelled over the hiss of the sprinklers. "I'll give you perfection." I took my grandfather's pocket watch, the broken, useless thing, and I jammed it hard into the pulsing root, into the heart of the system. For a second, nothing happened. Then the ground shuddered. The sprinklers didn't just stop, they reversed. Instead of spraying mist, they began to suck. A tremendous, inhaling sound tore through the community as the irrigation system pulled the water back from the lawns, from the flowers, from the air itself. The effect was instantaneous and horrifying. The flawless emerald lawns began to wither and die, turning brown and crumbling to dust in seconds. The geometrically perfect hedges twisted and sagged, their leaves turning black and falling off. The riotous flower beds rotted, the petals melting into a foul-smelling black sludge. The residents dropped their tools, clutching their throats. They weren't choking. They were fading. The forced pleasantness drained from their faces, leaving behind the raw, wrinkled, tired faces of people who had lived real, hard lives. The light in their eyes, the flat, placid light of the garden, flickered and went out, replaced by a dawning, terrible awareness. They were remembering. They were remembering the children they'd lost, the marriages that had failed, the money they'd squandered, the neighbors they'd betrayed. The pain they had buried and fertilized their paradise with came roaring back all at once. Mrs. Gable fell to her knees, not in prayer, but in agony, a long, silent scream of grief finally tearing from her throat. The perfect world was dying, and it was taking them with it. I ran. I left them there, weeping on their dead lawns, surrounded by the rotting remains of their perfection. I didn't look back. The police found me wandering on the main road, soaked, muddy, and in shock. When they went to investigate Serenity Springs, they found a different place. The gates were rusted. The houses were still there, but they were weathered, with peeling paint and overgrown yards. The residents were there too, but they were just normal, sad, confused, elderly people. There was no evidence of any crime, no buried tokens, no journal in the oak tree. My grandfather's shed was filled with rusty, broken tools. They chalked my story up to a stress-induced breakdown, a manifestation of my grief. I was sent to therapy. I never spoke about it again. I don't regret destroying their paradise. My regret is that I had to see the cost. My grandfather didn't leave me a job or a mystery. He left me his guilt. He made me the one who had to poison the garden because he no longer could. My regret is that I now understand the price of a quiet life. And sometimes, on a perfectly quiet summer day, I'll see a dandelion growing in a crack in the sidewalk, a bright, yellow, ugly, beautiful weed, and I'll smile. Because true peace isn't the absence of noise and pain. It's the courage to let the garden grow wild.